Greetings and welcome to our daily walk through the scriptures for March the 22nd. Your readings today saw you wrap up Numbers chapter 36, start the book of Deuteronomy, read Luke chapter 5, finish it out, and then start Luke chapter 6, the first 11 verses. And then you had Psalm 66, and then you had Proverbs 11, 24 through 26. Now, before we dive into our introduction to Deuteronomy, I do want to point out some things out of Luke that I find really great and a good reminder for us. As we get into Deuteronomy, the last book of the Pentateuch, hopefully you got some insight as you read some of the conversations that Jesus had. For example, in Luke chapter 6, when Jesus talks about being Lord of the Sabbath, hopefully you have a better understanding now of what the Sabbath is and why it was significant that Jesus said it. And this is what's so great about reading something like the Bible in 1 year. Yes, it's a lot of reading. Yes, it does a lot of back and forth. But as we've talked about several times, there are some beautiful parallels that come into it that should help shed light on the New Testament. Remember, we read the Old Testament in light of the New Testament. Okay? Meaning that the Old Testament points to Jesus, and now as we read about Jesus, we can look back and see how the Old Testament promises were fulfilled and what were the significant events and symbols that we find within the Old Testament. So hopefully you find this helpful. Now, as we read Deuteronomy, this is the last book of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, otherwise known in the Jewish culture as the Torah. Remember, for the Jews, the Torah is kind of, well, it's their Bible. There are the other writings, and they would call those the wisdom books. They would call those the writings of the prophets. And then they would write in the historical books. But the first 5 is really the cornerstone, if you will, of the Jewish faith. And so they use the other books as kind of supplements. So when you hear them, remember, when you hear them talking about the law, they're talking about these first 5 books. Now, Deuteronomy is, hopefully by now, you've gotten kind of an idea of what things are. Remember, Deuteronomy is traditionally attributed to being written by Moses. And Deuteronomy is kind of the closing remarks, if you will, in the last months of Moses' life. What you're going to read in Deuteronomy are a series of sermons that Noah basically preached to the Hebrews to help them as they get ready for their crossing into the Promised Land. They're basically right now sitting on the border. Now, we've gotten through, we just finished in Numbers, and Numbers was that 40 years, and so here they are. They're finally right at the border. Remember, the closing of Numbers, it was talking about a couple of the tribes wanted to hang on this side of the Jordan. Now the rest of them are about to cross over, and so Moses is giving some last-minute instructions. Now, also, one of the things that we should look at and realize when it comes to reading the Pentateuch is who was it written for? Oftentimes when we look at letters in the New Testament, we'll look at it and we'll say, well, why did Paul write this letter, and who are the Galatians or the Galatians or whatever they're called? Who are the Corinthians? Who was Peter writing to? Well, I think it's fair to ask, who was Moses writing to when he wrote these books? Well, he was writing to his fellow Israelites, but not the Israelites that you might think of. You see, this was not so much a writing to the current people or the people that came out of the Exodus. This is writing for those who were about to cross into the Promised Land. That was the value found in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, was the value shown to the people who were now, remember, a new generation. Prior to the crossing, the entire old generation, with the exception of 3 people, had passed away. Even Aaron had passed away. Even Miriam, Moses' sister, had passed away. And there are now only 3 people left from the original people of the Exodus, those people that had left, that were the adults, okay? So all those adults had passed away, and now the kids have become the adults, and they've become the leaders. So you had Moses, you had Joshua, and you had Caleb. Those were the only 3 that were left as a result of all of this 40 years in the wilderness. However, one of them, Moses, is not going into the Promised Land. Spoiler alert, we're going to read about it in the next day or two, why Moses was not able to cross. But as we read Deuteronomy, we need to think of it the same way. This is a reminder of what God has done so that you can have confidence in what God is going to do. When Moses is preaching and teaching to the people of Israel, that's exactly what he's trying to accomplish. Here's what God did for us, and here's what God is going to do for you, and he's going to continue to do. So as you dive into Deuteronomy, hopefully you've enjoyed the conversation found in Numbers. You have enjoyed the history. Well, now get ready for some really cool messages and encouragement from Moses and some great reminders. All right, with that being said, we'll talk next time.